siellä. Niin sit se, että sanoo vielä alkuun, että se on tosiaan siellä ja sit lähdetään tässä. Ja sit vaikka se, että voidaan kävellä niin Skardikin kautta, niin sinne voi viedä noin laukut. Ja että jos joku haluaa sen taksin, niin tulee sit sanoa ensi tauolla tähän. Ja jos haluaa sanoa niistä huoneista, niin voi sanoa, että 1 huone on tuolla päin seminaarihuoneista ja 3 on sit niinku tuolla.
Joo.
Because it's becoming darker and darker.
Yeah. En tiedä, tästä ei, kun painaa tästä, eikö tästä pitäisi tulla etuosa valot? Ei tapahdu mitään.
No ei tapahdu.
Kun ei toimisi.
Voi kun raivostuttavaa, kun jonkun tarvitsisi aina katsoa jonkun tekniikan ihmisen tuonne. Sitten me ottaa vaksikosta. Etuosa valot.
Kato, kun tässä on tää valot, etuosa, ei tapahdu mitään, niin meidän päällä. Ja kun olisi riippittäisiin. Pitäisi yrittää vielä tuolta.
Käydään
Olisi tää ollut hankalampi osuus.
Okei, mitä sä teit?
Mä painin tässä takaosan. Ja sitten tuli.
Okei.
Sen tosta kuitenkin. Ai sä painoit sieltä. Mä otetaan samaan aikaan. Mä painoin.
So nice to meet you.
I'm very impressed by your...
Sä tarvit tätä, että toinen.
Thank you so much. So, do I have to speak to the mic?
Yeah, well, unless you shout, but this should take quite well. So I'll just say something very shortly, and then you can say something about the network in the middle, and then I'll say a bit about practical stuff.
Stay here. I will sit down. Or
Yeah, because it's quite. If it's okay.
yeah.
Yeah, it's very full. It's going to be. It is.
I have chairs here and
Yeah. Okay, hello everyone. You are all most welcome to Turku and to the uses and abuses of storytelling conference. I am Hanna Meretoja, Professor of Comparative Literature here at the University of Turku and Director of the Research Center SELMA, Center for the Study of Storytelling, Experientiality and Memory. And I want to start by wishing you a very happy Friends Day, because, well, in the English-speaking world you might know the day as Valentine's Day, but in Finnish it's called Ystävänpäivä, which means the Friends' Day. So, well, not very romantic, I know, but we Finns like kind of down-to-earth kind of things and value friendship. So we call it Friends' Day. And I think it's actually a really great day to start this conference, because not only this is a gathering of old friends, but it's also a forum for making new friends. And I hope it will be the starting point of many long-lasting friendships. And this is the 5th symposium of the Narrative and Memory Network. Many of you have already been to earlier symposia of this network, but also every time there have been people who are new to the network, and especially this time there are a lot of you who are new to the network, and we are really happy that you are here and hope that you will join the network. And I run the network together with Enneken Lanes, and she will now say a few words on this network.
Thank you. Thank you, Hanna. I would also like to wish you very welcome to, as Anna said, our 5th symposium. This network, Narrative and Memory, Ethics, Aesthetics and Politics, is running for the 3rd year now. We have had conferences in Tallinn, in Saulkrasti, Latvia, in Agder, Norway, in Fore, Sweden, and now 5th here. We don't want to take much time away from the keynote, so I won't say more about the conferences. If you are interested in the content of these previous conferences, then check out our website, Narrative and Memory. And also, even if it's the last year of our network funded by the Nordic Summer University and Nordic Council of Ministers, we will try to continue with the network. And if you would like to become a member, there are a lot of members here in the room, but if you would like to become a new member, then just send an email to me and I will include your name on the website, on our website. So I wish a very successful conference to you.
Yeah, and just a couple of words on the topic of this conference. So we have both theoretical ambitions, trying to bring together the interdisciplinary fields of narrative studies and memory studies, and particularly looking at the interconnections of these concepts of narrative, memory, and identity. But we also think that this theme of the conference is very topical and relevant also politically relevant for what is going on in the world at the moment. So we hope there will be many stimulating discussions also on what is going on in the world right now, and is there something we could do about it. Now I want to finish this opening by thanking the whole team who have been organizing this conference, and most importantly, Eeva-Stina Kinnunen. She is really... So I really don't know what I would have done without her practical talents. My main practical contribution was writing a funding application in which I catastrophically miscalculated the budget. And luckily we still got the funding. It was a miracle. But after that I thought that I tried to leave the practical things as much as possible to Eeva-Stina, and that has worked really well. And we also have a great team of student assistants. Could you just briefly come here? So these great students of us, please don't hesitate to ask them about if you need any help with anything, any practical assistance, they are here for you. And there should be one student in every room where you are presenting also to help you with technical and practical issues. And so the whole conference will be in these two buildings. So there's Artium is the white building and Minerva the red building, which are joined together by this Janus seminar lecture hall and this area outside Janus. So everything is going to be in this complex. One of the seminar rooms is going to be in that white building over there, and 3 of them in the red building. But if you get lost, just ask for help from any of us. One more person I forgot to mention is Marta Chenedese. Are you here? Back there. So she's the new postdoc of Selma, and she has also helped me and Eneken and Eva-Stina with organizing the conference. And finally, I mentioned all the funders of the conference. So as you already heard, the Nordic Summer University is our main funder, which is in turn funded by the Nordic Council of Ministers. And we don't have much time now, but in the last session, during the concluding discussion, we will tell you a little bit more if you're interested about the Nordic Summer University. And the other funders are the Finnish Federation of Learned Societies, and then the School of History, Culture and Art Studies here at the University of Turku, and Selma Center, and finally our new Academy of Finland project, Instrumental Narratives. You will hear more about that in the roundtable tomorrow. And then finally about the practical issues, we will have the reception tonight after this at the City Hall in the city center of Turku, and we will walk together. So after we have the keynote now, and then we will have parallel sessions, and after the parallel sessions we will all meet here by the information desk outside this lecture hall, and we will walk together to the City Hall. And Turku has generously contributed by giving us nice food over there. And if any of you have not signed up for that, it's still possible to come. Everyone is welcome to join. Just please tell Eva-Stina if you have not signed up for that, and if you still want to come, and I hope all of you will join us tonight. And then finally, you might have noticed that it's really slippery. So that's one of my main worries, that somebody is going to get hurt, and it's kind of my fault because the weather is so bad. So please be careful. It's really, because the temperature has been going below and above 0, so it can be really icy. So if you have spikes, wear them, but I think most of you won't have spikes, so be careful. Okay, did I forget any? So the information desk is going to be open all the time during the whole conference. And when we walk tonight to the City Hall, we can walk by the hotel Scandic Julia. So if any of you have luggage, you can leave them there on the way to the City Hall. Okay, so I hope you will have a wonderful, stimulating symposium. Welcome once more. Okay, so now it's my great pleasure to introduce to you our first keynote speaker, Professor Mark Freeman. He is Distinguished Professor of Ethics and Society and also Professor of Psychology in the Department of Psychology at the College of Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts. His numerous publications include the following widely influential books, widely influential across narrative studies in various fields. So the books include Rewriting the Self, History, Memory, Narrative from Routledge 93, Finding the Muse, a Sociopsychological Inquiry into the Conditions of Artistic Creativity by Cambridge, 1994. Hindsight, The Promise and Peril of Looking Backward by Oxford University Press, 2010. And The Priority of the Other, Thinking and Living Beyond the Self, also by Oxford, 2014. He has also published numerous articles and chapters on issues ranging from memory and identity to the psychology of art and religion. He is the winner of the 2010 Theodore R. Sarbin Award in the Society for Theoretical and Philosophical Psychology, and he also serves as the editor of the Oxford University Press series Explorations in Narrative Psychology. Today he will give us a talk entitled What Have We Wrought? Narrative and Its Dangers. So please join me welcoming Mark Freeman.
Well, thank you, Hanna, and thank you, Annika and Evastina. It's been a warm welcome, and it's greatly appreciated. This is the first of the conferences you've organized I've been able to attend, and I'm delighted to be here. I figured I'd begin by explaining the title of my talk, which some of you might be puzzled about. It derives in part from a book I read earlier this year by Michiko Kakutani called The Death of Truth, subtitled Notes on Falsehood in the Age of Trump. Some of you may be familiar with it. In any case, much of what Kakutani says in the book would be familiar territory, I would guess, to many of you. But there's one part of it that I found especially provocative, and it has to do with the kinds of ideas some of us narrative types have been addressing through the years. Before I get to Kakutani, though, I want to take a few moments actually to revisit some work I did on related issues just about 2 years ago, shortly after Donald Trump was elected, in a piece called Whose Story, Whose World? Life and Narrative in the Age of Trump. As I wrote on the first page of that talk, at this particular moment in history, American history most obviously, but also world history, I find myself unable to pursue intellectual life without also speaking to the political scene, as exemplified especially in the rise of Donald Trump, who remarkably and absurdly now carries the august title of President of the United States. The good news, I went on to say, is much of what's at stake can, I think, profitably be explored by drawing on some of the many and varied traditions of narrative inquiry that exist. And so I said, I think it's urgent for us students of narrative to get in the game, try to shed a little light on things. And that's because, quote, a dark and foreboding cloud is there for many of us, at least in the States. As I went on to say, and here we get closer to the concerns of this talk, what happened during the campaign and what's happened after isn't just scary, it's dangerous. At that time, when things were just getting going, it seemed to me that there were three distinct dimensions of this danger. The first, not unrelated to the Nigerian writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's notion of the danger of the single story, is what I referred to back then as narrative homogenization, which is to say, the reduction of multiplicity and complexity into singularity. We see this danger in full bloom in the States in the current crisis over the border wall, which on Trump's account portrays the immigrant border crosser as dangerous intruder lurking on our doorsteps, ready to do some damage, or as the useless, skillless parasite or thief stealing from the natives. Lock the doors, put up fences, build walls. These two storylines, and there are certainly others, strike me as variations on a singular theme: the extrusion of the unwelcome other, so as to preserve the purity and primacy of the same. What's so striking and disheartening is realizing how appealing these storylines prove to be and still are for many Americans. That Trump himself is a vulgar, mean-spirited, narcissistic charlatan is bad enough. That half the members of Congress have towed the line on his behalf is also bad, but not terribly surprising. But the fact that half of the American people seem to have been harboring these fantasies of exclusion and extrusion, that Trump seems to have taken the lid off these base impulses and wishes, has been horrifying and revealing, particularly in the context of cultural memory and identity. We are not apparently what some of us had imagined. Many of the people we know or thought we knew are not what we imagined. This is the revelation of what I've referred to elsewhere as the narrative unconscious, albeit on a larger plane. We're talking about aspects of our history that had yet to become an explicit part of the story we tell ourselves. Well, they're a part of it now. And life has come to feel very different because of it. The second idea I had put forth at this talk, closely related to the first, is what I called narrative apocalypticism, which referred to the kind of totalizing narrative, what we might call a mono-narrative, that entailed the destruction of the established order and its replacement by a new one, a greater one that promised an unprecedented opportunity for redemption and salvation. Here are a few choice words from Trump's inauguration speech. You came by the tens of millions to become part of a historic movement, the likes of which the world has never seen before. At the center of this movement is a crucial conviction that a nation exists to serve its citizens. Americans want great schools for their children, safe neighborhoods for their families, and good jobs for themselves. These are just and reasonable demands of righteous people and a righteous public. But, and here's the pivot, for too many of our citizens, a different reality exists. Mothers and children trapped in poverty in our inner cities, rusted out factories scattered like tombstones across the landscape of our nation, an education system flush with cash, but which leaves our young and beautiful students deprived of all knowledge, and the crime and the gangs and the drugs that have stolen too many lives and robbed our country of so much unrealized potential. And now for a famous line some of you might have heard, the American carnage stops right here and stops right now. And I, of course, he was saying, am the one to make it happen. As for what was going on beyond our borders, we're also going to take on, and I quote again, radical Islamic terrorism, which he said we will eradicate from the face of the earth, along with all those other barbaric gangs all the world over lurking on the horizon, ready to pounce. Now, one of the things that's extra dangerous about these sorts of storylines, whether it's about the carnage here or the threat of carnage coming from without, is that there are elements that are bound to strike even skeptical readers as at least partially valid. In the first storyline, he's giving us some images that bear within them some measure of truth. Mothers and children trapped in poverty, substandard education, gang violence, and so on. And he's having them stand for the whole story. In the second, similarly, he's calling back images, especially from 9/11, and all the stories that derived from it, often in cinematic form, and having them signify all the other barbaric gangs the world over ready to attack. It's clever, in a way, and extremely dangerous. Extremely dangerous. I am here, he's essentially saying, to protect you. I am here to save you, and God sent me to do it. Trump himself didn't utter those words, not explicitly anyway, but I don't think it's stretching things to say that the narrative of the Savior, here to redeem the world, or at least the part of it he likes, was front and center throughout much of the campaign and since that time. Along these lines, there's no question in my mind but that for many his appeal is a religious one tied to purification and salvation. Trump knew how to tell this story, and in true messianic fashion, he gathered a big and devoted flock along the way, and it's still there. Apocalypticism, right? This too was a revelation. The fact that all of his heroic messianic rhetoric worked during the campaign or in the context of the inauguration speech is one thing. Fine, many thought. For some ridiculous reason you were elected, you can drop the Savior narrative now. And all of you followers, you can return to reality. But that's not what happened. It's quite extraordinary and maddening and saddening. The third danger I'd identified, finally, I called narrative solipsism. And here I was referring to the kind of dynamic wherein narrative loses its foothold in the real and becomes hermetically self-enclosed, such that one comes to live in a story world of one's own making. That Donald Trump may be in the process of living in such a world is troubling in its own right. That others, many others, seem to be joining him renders the situation nothing short of explosive. With these preliminary ideas in mind, let me offer a thesis of sorts that I had advanced earlier that goes something like this. When the relationship of narrative to reality is severed, we run the risk of falling prey to tyranny, the totalizing story being but a short step from totalitarianism. The question, of course, was what to do about it. As one article I'd read about how narrative had moved from literature to politics suggested, we need what the author referred to as professional narrative watchers. That is, a kind of skeptical monitor who, quote, would reveal how political parties and others seeking power use verifiable facts, half-truths, and misinformation to tell stories designed to promote their own interests. I guess I've become one of these, I said. And then I got a little preachy. The narrative watcher cannot afford to be the dispassionate observer, not now. No, the narrative watcher has to be a voice for the truth and a voice for justice. Yes, there are multiple truths. One could also argue, of course, that there are no truths, only interpretations. There's no getting around it. Narrative all the way down. This is familiar fare. But it needs to be resisted and rethought. There are at least three fronts for that resistance, and here I can stop referring to the earlier paper. In view of the process of narrative homogenization, it's imperative both to expose their totalizing singularity and to pluralize, that is, to seek and to create counter-narratives, ones that are more heterogeneous and polyphonic. In view of the threat of narrative apocalypticism and its resultant frenzies, it's imperative, I suggested, to undertake a kind of demythologization such that the archetypal allure of the story and the charismatic appeal of the storyteller are taken down to size. And in view of the threat of narrative solipsism, finally, it's imperative to hold open the relationship between life and narrative, between reality and narrative. And for all the challenges entailed in doing so, to seek the truth. Otherwise, we fall prey to tyranny, and as history has shown us all too clearly, it can be too late to undo the resultant damage. So that's where I was. That was February 2017, kind of paraphrased. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that I was somehow prophetic in uttering those words. Some of what I was discussing back then was as clear as day, and plenty of other people saw it. But little did I know just how bad and how dangerous things would get during the course of the 2 years since that time. Now, I continue to hold to the idea that we narrative types need to somehow get in the game, that is, to address some of the dangers that have emerged. And that is the main focus of this talk. But before getting there, I want to go back to Kakutani, who I introduced at the outset of the talk, and I want to confront her claim that some of the ideas that some of us have promoted, whether wittingly or not, or at least sympathize with, may have played some role in the current crisis. Her primary target in the book is what she refers to, borrowing a phrase from the Rand Corporation, as truth decay. Truth decay. How, she asks, did this happen? What are the roots of falsehood in the Trump era? How did truth and reason become such endangered species, and what does their impending demise portend for our public discourse and for the future of our politics and governance? With Trump, she writes, the personal is political, and in many respects, he is less a comic book anomaly than an extreme, bizarre world apotheosis of many of the broader, intertwined attitudes undermining truth today. From the merging of news and politics with entertainment, to the toxic polarization that's overtaken American politics, to the growing populist contempt for expertise, which of course is not limited to the States. As for where these intertwining attitudes may have come from, she points to, among other places, postmodernist theory, including some of those specific variants of it that focus on narrative. Quote, the migration of postmodern ideas from academia to the political mainstream, Kakutani writes, is a reminder of how the culture wars, as the vociferous debates about race, religion, gender, and school curricula recalled during the 1980s and 1990s, have mutated in unexpected ways. She goes on to speak of the embrace of subjectivity and the diminution of objective truth, the celebration of opinion over knowledge, feelings over facts, a development, she insists, that both reflected and helped foster the rise of Trump. Yikes. Right? Now, I don't know that many of the people here today would consider themselves kind of card-carrying postmodernists, right? I also don't know whether to buy Kakutani's mutation theory, that is, the idea that certain strands of postmodernist thinking somehow morphed into a tool for right-wing politicians and political strategists. Finally, I think her way of thinking about the problem of subjectivity, the need for objective truth, and so on, is too simple and sometimes sounds a bit right-wingish in its own right. But she does present a challenge here, at least for some of us. Given what many of us would regard as the inevitability or unsurpassability of interpretation, and given as well the fact of such interpretation generally assuming narrative form, what would constitute a proper response to the problems she's identified? If we're not going to respond to truth decay with some new, or more likely old, objectifying versions of truth, where exactly are we to turn? Putting aside the idea of narrative theory as possible complicity with the problems we currently face, the idea of which I still find somewhat dubious, there's no question about the seriousness of these problems. After drawing some connections between Trump and certain strands of Bolshevism, Nazism, and so on, she goes on to suggest a connection between Trump and Putin, the latter's model of propaganda having been deemed, quote, the fire hose of falsehood, an unremitting, high-intensity stream of lies, partial truths, and complete fictions spewed forth with tireless aggression to obfuscate the truth and overwhelm and confuse anyone trying to pay attention. She goes on to say this: the sheer volume of desinformatia unleashed by the Russian fire hose system, much like the more improvised but equally voluminous stream of lies, scandals, and shocks emitted by Trump, his geo-enablers, and media apparatchiks, tends to overwhelm and numb people while simultaneously defining deviancy down and normalizing the unacceptable. Outrage gives rise to outrage fatigue, which gives way to the sort of cynicism and weariness that empowers those disseminating the lies. Now, as Kakutani notes, Trump, of course, is a troll, both by temperament and by habit. His tweets and offhand taunts are the very essence of trolling: the lies, the scorn, the invective, the trash talk, and the rabid non sequiturs of an angry, aggrieved, isolated, and deeply self-absorbed adolescent who lives in a self-constructed bubble and gets the attention he craves from bashing his enemies in trailing clouds of outrage and dismay in his path. That was her, by the way. As she adds, some trolls have employed relativistic arguments to insist that their promotion of alternative facts is simply adding a voice to the conversation. that there are no more objective truths anymore, only different perceptions and different storylines. They are clearly using postmodernist arguments in bad faith, but their assertions, she writes, are no more disingenuous, really, than the efforts of Paul de Man's defenders to explain away his anti-Semitism by using deconstruction to argue that the articles he wrote for a pro-Nazi publication in the 1940s didn't really mean what they appeared to mean. Trump's lies, she continues, and then we can leave Kakutani behind. His efforts to redefine reality, his violation of norms and rules and traditions, his mainstreaming of hate speech, his attacks on the press, the judiciary, the electoral system, all are reasons that the democracy watchdog group Freedom House warned that year one of the Trump administration had brought further, faster erosion of America's own democratic standards than any other time in memory. And all are reasons that Orwell's portrait of an authoritarian state, in which Big Brother tries to control all narratives and define the present and the past, is newly relevant. There are no easy remedies, Kakutani admits, but it's essential that citizens defy the cynicism and resignation that autocrats and power-hungry politicians depend on to subvert resistance. So again, I would venture that most of the people here would stop short of identifying themselves, or at least some of you, as postmodernists or post-structuralists. Speaking for myself, in fact, much of the writing I've done through the years has worked on some level against certain strands of postmodern and post-structural theory, inspired especially by the hermeneutic philosophy of people like Paul Ricoeur and Hans-Georg Gadamer. One of my aims has been to try to underscore the primacy of interpretation without succumbing to the kind of relativism, or in some cases, nihilism, that these domains of theory sometimes embody. I know that's true of some of the other people who are here as well. At the same time, in the face of critiques like Kakutani's, I have found myself wondering about certain elements of my own thinking about interpretation, narrative, truth, and so on. I came to narrative by way of empiricist psychology, with its crudely objectifying ways of exploring human reality. My first stop on the journey I would take brought me to phenomenological psychology, which gave me at least an image of psychology that ran counter to its objectifying commitments, and that proved to be something of an antidote. Eventually, I had the great good fortune of studying with Ricoeur and others back in the 1980s and moved my explorations closer to narrative and narrative theory. As enchanted as I was with it, I also began encountering some versions of it that gave me pause and that seemed to me to be born more out of skepticism and in some cases a kind of inverted positivism. Having come to see some of the profound shortcomings of positivism, the impossibility of depicting the past as it was, the inevitable narrativizing that characterizes the writing of history, the inevitable fictionalizing that characterized non-fictional narrative literature, and so on. There were some who did a philosophical about-face and fashioned forms of theory and philosophy that were in some sense parasitic upon the positivism that they sought to leave behind. In any case, and to make a long story short, I found some of the work being done to be problematic and sought to fashion a more properly and defensibly hermeneutic approach, one that rather than jettisoning the search for truth, would try to articulate a more serviceable conception of it. Whether I succeeded in this is hard to say. What I can say now is that the broad project remains alive, and for me, as you can probably tell, it's acquired a new measure of urgency owing to what's been going on in the wider world, especially the political world. Most of us probably still find it difficult to speak of the unvarnished truth of history and tend to steer away still from the kind of absolutizing thinking that's sometimes seen as a necessary bulwark to the relativism and nihilism I spoke of earlier. At the same time, I would also guess that most of us have no problem at all identifying the patent distortions, narrative twistings, and outright falsehoods that Trump and his followers the world over spew forth. So here's the dilemma as I see it, or at least an element of it. We can't possibly indict these distortions, twistings, and falsehoods for what they patently are unless we have some working conception of what truth in the narrative domain is all about. Without this, all we can have is a war of competing narratives of exactly the sort we see in the political realm. Now, there may be no way ultimately to convert those who are so ensconced in their hermetically sealed narratives, false though they may be, that they reject other ones out of hand. This is certainly one of narrative's prime dangers. They can be utterly impervious to change, to being modified. Hence the narrative impasses and standstills that have come to characterize so much of the political landscape, at least in the States. At an extreme, it seems that people are not only telling incommensurable stories, but inhabiting incommensurable worlds. How is it possible, many of us in the States have asked repeatedly, that people could actually believe these stories they're being told? How can they be so clueless, so blind, and so on? I know it can sound arrogant to raise these kinds of questions, but I'd be lying to you if I told you that many of us didn't raise them. So what is to be done? What might be some of the strategies for moving beyond the impasses and standstills I just referred to? One morning during the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court, and I know some of you may know about that, but it was a fraught, awful thing, I wrote a quick email to some of my friends that said, never, ever in my life have I been as enraged as I am over this nomination process. As awful as so many of our days with Trump have been, this one's worse. I can't believe where we've landed. And here's what one of my friends wrote in response, and I admire him for it. He said, "My first reaction is to think we need to better understand the implications of living in a country where the victims are portrayed as the perpetrators, where the isolated, rejected, and deprived are denigrated as privileged, where the true fears and trembling of the weak are swept away by the contrived tears of the entitled, where principles, morality, and dignity are readily abandoned for power and self-interest, and where truth is called lies and lies are held to be true. But when I try to better understand it, I have anger that seems to serve no purpose, despair that leads me towards resignation, and faith that is quickly being extinguished by hopelessness. So I have no wish to better understand. Today, I only wish to remain willing to love and be loved and to have you all as friends. Perhaps tomorrow I will find a way to do more." They're really quite lovely, I think, and a good deal more mature and forward-looking than my own response. I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit and share with you another email from the very same person that came a bit later. Just to give you a brief sense of how things have changed over the past year, here's what my Let's Love One Another friend wrote a short while ago when he and I and a couple of others were planning a dinner outing and faced the possibility of returning to a favorite restaurant that happened to have loud salsa music that night. He wrote, "Do we really want salsa night again? At this point, I'm in such despair, I just want to get drunk. Even food sucks at this point. Is it wrong to loathe millions of people?" That was a paraphrase, actually. His words were a bit more severe, but I'll spare you what they were. So not so lovely anymore. But given the utter intractability of the other's narrative position, and perhaps one's own, what else might one wish for except that these others somehow be silenced or sent away to some faraway space station of their own kind where they can bask in their own fictions and lies? thinking this way is not good. In fact, it underscores just how urgent some other mode of responding is. But what? Right now, there's a real sense of futility and impotence for many of us, and even 2 years in, rage. If truth be told, there have been a number of instances over the past 2 years when I thought of sending out a letter to those of my relatives who were Trump synthesizers, in which I would essentially say, we're done. Sorry. Right? It's gotten that bad, and it's profoundly affected my own sense of self, my sense of belonging, my sense of history, and more. I apologize that so much of what I'm speaking about here today is about Trump and the American situation, but for me and many others, it's become something of an obsession, and I think it says a lot about some of the larger issues that the conference seeks to address. So again, what is to be done? I can't claim to have a great solution to the problems I've been addressing here, but for my part, I think they need to be addressed on at least two fronts. One negative or critical, and one positive, or at least more so. For the negative project, I suggest, among other things, composing a sort of catalog or inventory of narrative dangers, tied in this case to Trump, but moving well beyond it. I've already mentioned a few. Earlier I mentioned narrative homogenization, apocalypticism, and solipsism. But there's a bunch more, virtually all of which may be traced back to Trump and his followers, as well as their predecessors in numerous nations and cultures throughout the world. Let me just enumerate some. First, flat-out, bald-faced lies. Stories for which there is concrete evidence providing the desired testimony that runs utterly contrary to what is being asserted. Examples. The turnout for the inauguration was massive. This was one of the most impressive electoral vote victories of all time. I never did that, I never said this, I created this, I prevented that, and on and on and on. I'll spare you the details. As the news commentator Chris A. Hayes has stated succinctly, the president is a liar. He lies about matters of the utmost consequence, nuclear diplomacy, and about the most trivial, his golf game. He lies about things you can see with your own eyes. He lies about things he had just said moments ago. He lies the way a woodpecker attacks a tree, compulsively, insistently, instinctively. He lies until your temples throb. He lies until you want to submerge your head in a bucket of ice and pray for release. And yet, Hayes adds, millions of people either believe what he says or delight in his obvious deceptions. For Hayes, therefore, it feels very much as if something has ripped in the fabric of reality itself. It's extremely hard to counteract. Second, stupid, pathetic narrative twistings, as I called them earlier. During the campaign, Trump repeatedly said that Mexico would pay for his beloved border wall. There were loud chants about it during the campaign. Who's going to pay? He yelled out. Everybody would answer, Mexico. So it was nothing short of a mantra, right? Recently, though, he backpedaled. How? Quote, I never said Mexico would write a check for the wall. Well, that's true. He never used those exact words. Presumably, he would have accepted credit cards as well. But these are lies by any other name. They're finagled by some simplistic wordplay that he thinks can just get him exonerated. These are very appealing as well. Virtual lies, i.e., stories for which there is substantial evidence suggesting otherwise, but enough material to allow for some small measure of contestability. The border wall situation I mentioned before is, of course, relevant here. There unquestionably are some challenges to be met in the arena of border security. And it's also true, as Trump pointed out in a recent address to the nation in graphic detail, that some border crossers are criminals and have done some very bad things. He loves to tell those kind of stories. Let me tell you the story of so-and-so. But so too, many critics have pointed out, have crimes been committed by those born and raised in our fair country? And in fact, the percentage of immigrants who've created these heinous crimes that he loves to talk about is substantially less than what we find in the proverbial natives. Rachel Maddow, a well-known news person in the States, has called this rational but false threat inflation. The language of crisis, maybe even enough of one to declare a national emergency, is ubiquitous here and serves to tap into the dread of the other that is, in fact, part of the American story, revealed in fuller bloom, perhaps, than it had been in some time. Fourth, one more category Rachel Maddow's talked about, she simply calls magical nonsense. I'd like to put a little more flesh on this idea by calling it delusional reality decreeing. Right? This is basically when one believes that by saying it makes it so. Right? I've been tougher on Russia than anyone. ISIS has been defeated. North Korea is no longer a nuclear threat, and so on. Now, as Maddow points out, and this is very important, I think, in terms of narrative reception, oftentimes with trumpets is just an attempt to rally people, to fire them up. And it may have absolutely nothing to do with the reality of the situation. So what's especially dangerous about this particular danger is that the reality factor may not matter to the teeming masses jazzed by the fiery rhetoric. So we're talking here about illusion, wish fulfillment by any other name. Would that we could defeat ISIS, and would that the nuclear threat was gone. Well, if you wish that to happen, perhaps you even believe the lies that people tell you. Fifth, it's a short step from here to what might be termed crudely calculated pseudo-identification. There was, for instance, Trump's famous proclamation that, quote, I love the poorly educated. Or his Cinco de Mayo tweet of 2016, the best taco bowls are made in Trump Tower Grill. I love Hispanics. Maybe he loves both of these categories of people. Maybe he's a true humanitarian, a philanthropist in the deepest and best sense of the term. More likely, though, he uttered those words and lots of others in order to cajole his target audiences into voting his way. Now, of course, he's not doing anything much more in these proclamations than being a politician, ultimately of a particularly crude and transparent sort. I mean, what politician doesn't pander to the people? One might even argue that being a politician requires this sort of authenticity, and that Trump simply has the audacity not to hide it. In this respect, it might be argued further by his followers that even amidst this clear inauthenticity is a kind of authenticity, namely the authenticity of being willing to say anything and everything, no matter how silly or false, in order to advance his own agenda. Of course he's going to tell everybody he loves them. At least he's not resorting to that sort of unctuous politician speak that pretends to be sincere, some would say. Remarkably enough, it seems that in the eyes of some, Donald Trump was able to turn inauthenticity into a virtue, refreshing in its unabashed transparency. A related danger is what might be called the delusional boast, or the self-aggrandizing fiction. A couple of choice sentences. I know more about ISIS than the generals do, believe me. I understand the tax laws better than almost anyone. Nobody knows banking better than I do. Nobody knows politicians better than Donald Trump. We find some extension of this seemingly extraordinary wealth of knowledge in his joyous proclamation shortly after his election that, quote, we have by far the highest IQ of any cabinet ever assembled. These are absurdities, and one would think that they'd be named as such and that he'd be taken to task for them. But it hasn't happened. Certainly not among his followers, his base, as it's often called. It's astounding, and it's horrifying. A couple more. Projective reversals. Fake news. Comey's a liar. No wonder the economy's going downhill. The Fed chair's responsible. And so on. In other words, none of this is my fault. It's your fault. Loud, disingenuous dodges. There's no collusion. It's a witch hunt. It's a hoax. And this despite the fact that there's massive evidence to the contrary. It is true that there has yet to be adduced definitive proof that Trump himself colluded with Russia. So if one wants to adhere stubbornly to the letter of the law rather than the spirit, and some clearly do, the Mueller investigation that's been going on may seem like a terribly unfair targeting of an innocent man. But given the massive evidence available, which has led to indictments, confessions, prison sentences, and more, the protests are ridiculous. They constitute an outright refusal of narrative. The supposition that even though it all fits together into a compelling and near self-evident storyline, it's not enough to proclaim his guilt. Two more. Narrative obfuscation. We are awash in stories, and they proliferate. This isn't just a matter of, quote, spin. It's a matter of putting so many narratives out there that people, as we said earlier, may be just plain exhausted, worn out, trying to discern what's for real and what's not, a kind of narrative fatigue. 10th and finally for now, there's the consequence of all this, which might simply be called the narrative derealization problem. And here I'm referring to the idea that because of this obfuscation and fatigue, there may arrive the conviction that there truly are no non-tainted stories to be told, that narrative itself is ultimately the problem, and that consequently it needs to be abandoned in favor of some other genre, some other device for extricating ourselves from the narrative morass. This might entail anything from a retrogressively insistent return to the facts and the facts alone, all the way to a truly and avowedly nihilistic ideologism, as it might be called. That is, a stance that says, in the end, it's all about power and self-interest. The first of these positions is untenable. In this sense, I suppose we are all, I assume, postmodernists of a sort. Facts are important, to be sure, and sometimes they can be established in a fairly clean way. But they often can't, also. And they alone cannot possibly suffice to provide the accounts required to set records straight. Right? As for the second position, it's also untenable as well as entirely too cynical. Plus, in its own quasi-positivistic way, it assumes that the world is itself narratively unformed, and that as such, any and all stories told can't help but serve some ideological cause. And so it devolves into a kind of instrumentalism. And if history is any indication, those with the biggest and loudest instruments often come out on top. Not good. Not good. This process of narrative derealization is perhaps the ur-danger, the danger of dangers. And that's because it obviates the very possibility of entering the game, as I put it earlier, and gives it over to political, epistemological, and not least moral ideologues of one stripe or another. Now, if I were to advance a kind of motto for the position I want to advocate as I move towards closing, it would be something like fight narrative with narrative. And fight it with as much integrity and moral clarity as we can possibly muster. Now, this may strike some of you as both too idealistic and too impracticable. How exactly does it translate into getting in the game? The challenge is huge. As CNN's Brian Stelter has argued, Trump is winning the storytelling game with help from his friends in the media. That's the title of a piece that he did this past August. Watch enough of President Donald Trump's rallies and his power as a storyteller shines through. He's the savior, the hero, the dragon.